Jacob Wilson was different, and everyone knew it. Born with severe disabilities, both mental and physical, he had spent his entire life in a wheelchair. His body was frail, his legs twisted and unusable, and his mind was slower than the others in his school. His eyes, however, were sharp, deep pools of sadness and quiet pain that few noticed. He never spoke much, and when he did, it was with slurred words that made even the teachers impatient. The other kids, the ones who could walk and run, were merciless. Day after day, they would torment him, laughing at the way his head lolled to the side, the way his body spasmed involuntarily, and how his hands shook when he tried to write. They called him names, cruel, heartless names that burned into his soul like branding irons. Retard, they sneered. Cripple. Freak. He would sit in his wheelchair, hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white, his head hanging low as he tried to drown out the jeers. But he felt every word like a knife to the chest. What hurt even more was the feeling of helplessness, that no matter how much he wished for it, he could never fight back. But Jacob was not completely helpless. Deep within, beneath the surface of his broken body, was a gift. It was subtle, so faint that even he hadn't realized it for years. But every time someone hurt him, whether it was a cruel word, a shove, or a prank that left him humiliated, something shifted. Not outwardly, not at first. It was as if a balance deep within the universe dipped ever so slightly, just enough that the bully, without realizing it, began to change. The first time it happened, Jacob didn't notice. He was 8, and a boy named Tommy had shoved him out of his wheelchair and laughed as he tumbled to the ground. That night, Jacob lay in bed, his body aching, when something strange began to stir in him. He felt stronger, just for a moment. Tommy, on the other hand, woke the next day with a terrible limp. The doctors were baffled. There was no medical explanation. Tommy's legs just seemed to have given out overnight. His parents shrugged it off as some strange injury from playing rough, and so did Tommy. But Jacob knew. In the days that followed, Jacob noticed something. The more Tommy teased him, the worse Tommy's limp became. And with each taunt, Jacob felt a little less weak, a little less trapped. But Jacob didn't yet understand the full extent of what was happening. By the time they were all in middle school, the teasing had only grown worse. There were new bullies now, an entire pack of them who took joy in tormenting Jacob. Tommy had stopped coming to school altogether. His legs had deteriorated so much that he had to use crutches. His friends, though, hadn't learned the lesson. They still laughed, still found new ways to make Jacob's life miserable. Mark was the worst of them. He was big for his age, with a cruel grin and a voice that always seemed too loud, especially when it was directed at Jacob. He loved making a show of Jacob's weaknesses, drawing a crowd as he pushed Jacob's wheelchair into the mud or knocked his tray out of his hands in the cafeteria. "What's wrong, Jacob?" Mark would sneer. "Can't you walk?" "Oh, wait, I forgot, you're a freak," and the others would laugh. But after a while, Mark started having problems too. It began subtly, with his hands. He would drop things more often, or his fingers would twitch uncontrollably. The more he tormented Jacob, the worse it got. One day, in the middle of gym class, Mark collapsed. His legs, for no reason anyone could explain, simply stopped working. Jacob had watched from the sidelines, his heart pounding, a strange feeling of satisfaction creeping up his spine. He still couldn't fully understand it, but something inside him knew. With every word, with every cruel joke or shove, he was taking something from them. As time passed, Jacob's condition began to improve. His hands, once shaky and weak, were steadier. His speech, though still slurred, became clearer. His legs, once limp and twisted, no longer hurt as much. But with each of his improvements, his tormentors grew worse. Mark was confined to a wheelchair by the end of the school year, his body weakening with no explanation from the doctors. The others, too, were beginning to show signs. Sarah, who had always giggled the loudest at Mark's jokes, started to have trouble focusing in class. She became forgetful, confused, struggling to remember simple things. It was as if her mind was slowly deteriorating. Tyler, who had once been the fastest runner in school, developed a tremor in his legs. He could barely walk by the time they entered high school. The changes were slow, almost imperceptible at first, but Jacob noticed, and more than that, he felt it. Each time one of them suffered, he grew stronger. The power inside him was becoming more potent, and with it came an awareness, a control he hadn't had before. By the time they reached senior year, Jacob had regained much of his physical ability. He no longer needed his wheelchair, though he still pretended to use it at times, waiting, biding his time. His body was strong now, his mind sharper than ever. But the others? They had become shadows of their former selves. Mark, once the biggest bully, was now a shell of a person. He slumped in his wheelchair, drooling slightly, his eyes vacant and unfocused. Sarah could barely string a sentence together. Tyler had to be fed by Nurse. One by one, they had inherited Jacob's afflictions, until they were nothing more than the helpless, broken people they had once mocked. And Jacob, now walking tall and proud, stood above them all. The day it all came to a head was the day of the senior prom. Jacob hadn't been planning to attend. He was still seen as an outsider, someone beneath the notice of his classmates. But something had changed within him over the years. The power that had slowly been growing, the power that had transformed him, was now in full bloom. He no longer felt fear. He no longer felt helpless. He felt invincible. So, he went. As he entered the gym, heads turned. The students who had once mocked him now looked at him in confusion, unsure of what they were seeing. He walked with a confidence they had never known, his head held high, his body strong and poised. The whispers started almost immediately. Is that Jacob? How is he walking? What happened to him? The bullies, what remained of them, were all there. Mark, slumped in his wheelchair, his head drooping to the side. Sarah, sitting at a table with a blank expression, her hands twitching uncontrollably. Tyler, strapped into a special chair, his once athletic body now emaciated and weak. Jacob walked straight toward them. There was a moment of silence as he stood before them, and then, for the first time in years, he spoke. His voice was clear, strong, and filled with a quiet fury that sent shivers down the spines of those who could still feel. You laughed at me, he said, his eyes locking onto Mark's vacant stare. You mocked me. You made me feel like nothing. Mark's mouth opened, but no words came out. His body trembled, a faint glimmer of recognition flickering in his dull eyes. But now, Jacob continued, you're nothing. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving them behind in their broken, ruined bodies. The rest of the night passed in a blur for the others. No one could understand what had happened to Jacob, how he had gone from being the crippled boy in a wheelchair to the strong, confident man who had walked into the prom. Rumors swirled, but no one had any answers. But Jacob knew. He had always known, deep down, that there was something different about him. And now, he was finally free. Free from the torment, free from the pain, free from the weakness that had once defined him. As for the bullies, they would live the rest of their lives as Jacob had once lived his, paralyzed, mentally broken, helpless. They had taken so much from him, and now, piece by piece, he had taken it all back. Jacob left the school that night, walking into the cool night air with a smile on his face. For the first time in his life, he felt whole, and as he disappeared into the darkness, the faint sound of laughter echoed behind him. But this time, it was his.